You are shivering in a freezing cave holding your dying child. Their bones are mysteriously bending like rubber under their own weight. The enemy killing them isn't the cold nor a curse. The assassin is the very skin you are wearing. 30,000 years ago, human beings were forced into a terrifying biological trade-off just to survive the freezing dark. Watch until the end of this video to discover the brutal evolutionary secret hidden in your skin color and how this ancient survival mechanism is secretly controlling the world today. Your skin is not an identity. It is a survival receipt paid for in blood. To understand why your child's bones are shattering inside this freezing cave, we have to look back at the continent you left behind. When your ancestors walked the scorching plains of Africa, the sun was not a gentle source of warmth. It was a relentless nuclear reactor, bombarding the Earth with ultraviolet radiation. Most people today think of a sunburn as a mild annoyance, but in the primordial world, that same radiation was an invisible executioner. It targeted a specific fragile compound circulating in human blood, folate, also known as vitamin B9. Why does a microscopic vitamin matter when you are dodging saber-toothed cats? Because without folate, human reproduction completely collapses. Folate is the fundamental building block required for DNA synthesis and cell division. When a pregnant woman is exposed to intense, unshielded UV radiation, the rays penetrate her skin and systematically destroy the folate in her bloodstream. The consequences are beyond horrific. Without adequate folate, a developing fetus suffers massive neural tube defects. Babies are born with exposed spinal cords, a condition known as spina bifida, or they are born missing major portions of their brain and skull. In the unforgiving reality of the Pleistocene epoch, a baby born with an exposed spine was not just a tragedy, it was a guaranteed, agonizing death. It meant the absolute extinction of your bloodline. To survive this invisible radiation, the human body engineered a brilliant, impenetrable biological armor: melanin. Melanin is a complex dark pigment that acts like a microscopic umbrella over the nucleus of your skin cells. It absorbs and scatters the deadly UV rays before they can penetrate the blood vessels and destroy the precious folate. Under the African sun, dark skin was the ultimate biological superpower. If you had dark skin, you lived. Your folate was protected, your children were born healthy, and your tribe multiplied. If you did not, the sun sterilized your genetic lineage. It was that simple. Dark skin was never about race. It was a literal shield forged in the fires of extreme solar radiation. Do you know what is truly terrifying about survival? The very thing that saves your life today will be the exact thing that kills you tomorrow. Your ancestors were restless. Driven by climatic shifts or the primal urge to wander, they began the greatest journey in human history: the migration out of Africa. They walked out of the blistering heat, crossed the Middle East, spread across Asia, and pushed up into the frozen, dark tundras of ancient Europe. This is where the nightmare begins. This is why you are shivering in this cave, watching your child die. As your tribe moved into the high latitudes of Europe, the environment drastically changed. The sun in these regions is incredibly weak, especially during the long, brutal winters when the earth is tilted away from the sun. The days are short, the skies are constantly overcast, and you are forced to wrap yourself head to toe in thick animal furs just to keep from freezing to death. Suddenly, the impenetrable melanin armor that had kept your ancestors alive in Africa became a fatal liability. While the thick melanin successfully blocked the weak northern sunlight from destroying folate, it also blocked something else entirely: the synthesis of vitamin D. Unlike most other essential nutrients, you cannot get enough vitamin D just by eating mammoth meat or gathering wild roots. Your skin must photosynthesize it directly from ultraviolet B radiation. When UVB rays hit your skin, they interact with a cholesterol compound to create vitamin D3. This vitamin is the absolute key that allows your intestines to absorb calcium from your diet. Without vitamin D, your bones literally cannot harden. One leading scientific theory suggests that this sudden lack of vitamin D triggered a horrifying epidemic. Because your tribe's thick melanin blocked the already weak sunlight, their bodies stopped producing the vital hormone. The results were gruesome. The children developed rickets, a severe bone disease. Their legs bowed outwards under the weight of their own bodies, forming grotesque curves that made running and hunting impossible. Their pelvises deformed and shrank. For a young woman in the Stone Age, a deformed pelvis meant that childbirth became a guaranteed death sentence. The baby could not pass through the birth canal, resulting in a prolonged, agonizing death for both mother and child in the dirt of the cave. Their skeletons were crumbling from the inside out. The dark skin, the very armor that had saved them in Africa, was now starving them of sunlight. But deformed bones were not the only nightmare. Vitamin D is not just for building skeletons. It is the master switch for the human immune system. Without it, the body's ability to fight off respiratory infections completely collapses. As your tribe huddled together in the damp, freezing air of the cave, sharing every breath and every germ, the lack of vitamin D meant that a simple winter cold could rapidly turn into fatal pneumonia. The children were not just crippled, they were suffocating from chest infections their bodies could no longer fight. They were dying in the dark, coughing up blood, while their immune systems, starved of sunlight, simply shut down. The lack of vitamin D was a slow, agonizing execution. Have you ever felt like your greatest strength suddenly became your absolute biggest weakness? If you have, hit the like button, because you share the exact same evolutionary trauma as these ancient pioneers. What you call an identity is nothing more than a biological tax collected by a hostile environment. As the winters dragged on, a slow, terrifying mutation began to appear in the tribe. A few children were born with a genetic defect. Their skin lacked pigment. They were pale, almost translucent. Imagine the perspective of a dark-skinned mother in that cave, holding a newborn who looks like they have been drained of life. At first, the tribe viewed these pale children with pity and disgust. They looked weak, sick, and vulnerable. They looked like ghosts haunting the campfire, stripped of the rich ancestral identity that defined their people. But as the years passed, something disturbing became mathematically obvious to the tribe's survival. These pale, mutated children were the only ones whose bones were not breaking. Their legs grew straight, their spines were strong. Their pale skin, stripped of the melanin armor, acted like a desperate solar sponge, soaking up the weak, pathetic northern sunlight just enough to synthesize the necessary vitamin D. This was not an advancement. It was not a racial upgrade. It was an act of absolute biological desperation. The human body intentionally destroyed its own UV protection, bleaching the skin to a pale white. To understand the terrifying logic of evolution, you have to realize that nature does not care about your identity. It only cares about what keeps you breathing. The humans who turned white survived because they made a brutal genetic trade-off. They sacrificed their protection against skin cancer and folate destruction in exchange for strong bones. They traded one biological currency for another just to survive the freezing dark. But biology is never as cruel as psychology. As the deep freeze sets in, resources become scarce. The mammoth herds move further away. The berries are buried under 6 feet of snow. The tribe is starving. The healthy, pale-skinned mutants, the ones with strong legs and straight spines, are the only ones capable of hunting efficiently. The dark-skinned members, crippled by rickets, become a massive burden. They consume the limited meat but cannot contribute to the hunt. You might think that in a tight-knit prehistoric tribe, compassion would prevail. But human nature, when pushed to the absolute edge of starvation, is ruthlessly pragmatic. The healthy, pale-skinned hunters look at the crippled, dark-skinned members of the tribe. They realize a dark truth. If they share their food, everyone will starve. If they hoard the food for themselves, the strong will survive. But how do you justify abandoning your own people? Imagine the psychological torture of the pale hunter. That crippled, dark-skinned man consuming the meat is not a stranger. He is your brother. But if you carry him, your own pale, healthy child will starve to death in the snow. The logic of survival forces a horrifying moral calculation. Somebody has to die. To execute that calculation without losing your own sanity, you need a psychological mechanism to distance yourself from the guilt of murder by starvation. You have to convince yourself that the person you are abandoning is somehow different from you. And there it is, staring them right in the face. The color of the skin. It wasn't just a physical difference anymore. The terrifying logic of the human brain turned it into a visual marker of weakness. The pale hunters began to look at the dark skin not as a shared heritage, but as a sign of disease, a curse from the spirits, a mark of the other. To survive the emotional trauma of leaving their family to die, they had to dehumanize them. They used the crude visual difference created by a biological mutation to draw a psychological line in the snow. Us versus them. The healthy versus the crippled. The pale versus the dark. This was not an ideological racism born of hatred. It was a cold, calculated strategy for resource hoarding. They weaponized a biological adaptation to justify abandoning the weak. You watch in horror as the healthy hunters pack up the remaining meat and their weapons. They do not look you in the eye. They simply walk out of the cave, leaving you and your crying, crippled child behind in the freezing darkness. The fire begins to die. The cold creeps in. Now, while we don't have archaeological fossils proving this exact event happened, anthropologists believe this kind of terrifying in-group and out-group bias based on skin color was not a philosophical debate. It was likely a death sentence delivered in the snow born out of sheer survival panic. Imagine this theoretical scene acting as the psychological blueprint for humanity, repeating over and over again in countless desperate tribes scattered across the frozen north. It is a grim illustration of how human psychology, when pushed to the absolute edge of starvation, will weaponize anything, even a genetic mutation, to justify hoarding resources. Would you have done the same? If your child was healthy and starving, would you have abandoned the weak to ensure your own bloodline survived? It is a terrifying question, isn't it? Let us know in the comments if you think modern humans would act any differently if the grocery store is empty tomorrow. The color of your flesh is not a marker of superiority. It is just a genetic compromise forced upon your ancestors. Fast forward 30,000 years to the modern world. We have constructed towering glass skyscrapers, launched satellites into the void of space, and split the atom. We live in climate-controlled boxes, insulated from the freezing winters and the scorching savannas. Yet, the primitive psychological wiring that doomed you in that cave is still perfectly intact in the brains of the 8 billion people walking the earth today. We took that ancient, desperate survival mechanism, the instinct to use physical differences as a marker for resource allocation, and we scaled it up into a global nightmare. We have built entire civilizations, social hierarchies, and brutal caste systems based entirely on the amount of melanin in our skin. We have waged devastating wars, enslaved entire continents, and justified the most unspeakable atrocities over a biological mechanism that is nothing more than a geographical adaptation to sunlight. The dark psychology of race is that we have taken a receipt of solar radiation and weaponized it into a tool of absolute dominance. We look at a person with dark skin and a person with light skin, and instead of seeing two brilliant evolutionary strategies for absorbing ultraviolet radiation, we invent arbitrary, lethal concepts of superiority and inferiority. We have allowed a simple chemical called melanin, a chemical designed purely to protect unborn babies from neural tube defects, to dictate who gets access to power, resources, wealth, and basic human dignity. This is the ultimate, tragic cognitive bias of the human species. Our brains are fundamentally hardwired to categorize, to rapidly separate the world into us and them, to ensure our own tribal survival during times of perceived scarcity. From a purely computational perspective, the brain is lazy. When resources are low and stress is high, it doesn't have the energy to evaluate every individual's character. It relies on crude, fast heuristics. It constantly scans the environment for visual differences to quickly identify potential threats or competitors for resources. And what is the most immediate, unchangeable visual difference between two human beings? Skin color. We took a biological response to the sun and turned it into the foundation of systemic racism. We used our own evolutionary history against ourselves. But let's dig even deeper into the darkest corners of this psychological trap. The logic of oppression requires a narrative to sustain itself. The biological mutation that stripped the melanin from the skin of those northern pioneers did not just give them vitamin D. It gave them an unintentional psychological weapon. Throughout human history, light has been associated with the divine, with the sun, with purity. simply because humans are diurnal creatures who fear the predators that hunt in the dark. When populations from the north eventually re-encountered populations from the south, this primitive psychological bias was ready to be exploited. The people who had retained their melanin armor, the ones perfectly adapted to the sun's lethal radiation, were suddenly, violently recast in the narrative of human history. The pale-skinned descendants of those freezing caves looked at the dark skin of their southern counterparts and did not see the magnificent biological shield that it was. Instead, they weaponized their own mutation. They used the pale skin born of starvation and rickets as a symbol of superiority. They used the dark skin born of solar defense as a symbol of the primitive. This was not a biological truth, it was a psychological sleight of hand. It was the greatest, most devastating marketing campaign in the history of the human species. Think about the sheer, terrifying scale of this deception. We built the transatlantic slave trade, a system that commodified human flesh and inflicted centuries of generational trauma entirely upon a biological misunderstanding of vitamin D and folate. We drew arbitrary lines on maps, segregated schools, and denied human beings the right to vote, all because some of our ancestors lived closer to the equator while others lived closer to the poles. We turned a sunburn receipt into a global caste system. And you are still participating in it today. Every time you cross the street because someone of a different skin color approaches, every time a resume is discarded because a name sounds too ethnic, every time you feel a flicker of unconscious bias, you are acting out the terrified programming of a freezing caveman. You are letting the ghosts of the Ice Age dictate your modern morality. You are being manipulated by a prehistoric adaptation that has absolutely no relevance in a world of sunscreen, vitamin D pills, and global travel. The biological pressures that created different skin colors are completely obsolete in the modern metropolis. A light-skinned person living under the intense sun of modern Australia now suffers massive, unprecedented rates of skin cancer because they lack the melanin armor their current environment absolutely requires. A dark-skinned person living in the cloudy gloom of Northern Europe or working night shifts in a windowless office now suffers from severe vitamin D deficiency because the ambient sunlight is too weak to penetrate their natural shield. We are biologically mismatched with the world we have built, yet we violently defend the social hierarchies based on these outdated genetic traits. In the modern corporate boardroom, the exact same primitive dynamics play out. We form cliques, we hoard promotions, we exclude those who look, speak, or act differently from the dominant group. We may not be abandoning each other in a freezing cave to die of starvation, but we are still using subtle visual and cultural markers to justify who gets the resources and who gets left out in the cold. The boardroom is just a cave with better lighting and more expensive suits. If you are enjoying this deep dive into human psychology, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more Primitive Life. The question is, now that you know the truth, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to continue letting a biological technicality control your perception of reality? Or are you going to wake up and see the human race for what it truly is? A singular, desperate, beautiful species that simply wore different armor to survive the radiation of a dying star. The next time you look at someone with a different skin color, or the next time you look at the back of your own hand, I want you to remember the brutal evolutionary forge that created it. Whether you are dark-skinned, light-skinned, or somewhere in the middle, your ancestors endured unimaginable suffering, disease, and agonizing genetic mutations just so you could be here today. Your skin is a monument to their survival. It is a testament to the desperate, violent lengths the human body will go to in order to keep its bloodline alive. Underneath the societal illusions of race, class, and identity, we are all just descendants of the African savanna. We are all the exact same species, wearing different degrees of biological sunscreen, desperately trying to survive the radiation of a hostile star in a cold, indifferent universe. We conquered the environment long ago. The question is whether we can survive our own psychology. Will we continue to let a prehistoric, sun-induced adaptation divide us, or will we finally recognize the shared, desperate humanity hiding beneath our skin? Every time we choose division based on skin color, we are surrendering our intellect to a primitive survival reflex that is tens of thousands of years out of date. If this journey into the dark origins of human skin color has shattered your perception of reality, then do not simply scroll away. Subscribe to Primitive Life. We are here to tear down the illusions of modern civilization and expose the raw, primitive instincts that still dictate your every move. Because the only way to escape the programming of the past is to understand it. Join us and uncover the reality hidden in your DNA. Your skin may be a survival receipt, but your mind is still yours to reclaim.